Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moffat coming at you with another APGov video. Today we're taking a look at topic 1.7, focusing on the relationship between the states and the federal government. Now, when we start talking about, the American style of government, it is defined by what we call federalism. So if we are saying that federalism defines how our government operates in a functional way, we should have a pretty good idea of what federalism is. And, having a federal government means that you have different levels of sovereign government working simultaneously. A national level and some sort of state level of some sort. You could call it a provincial level if it's non-unitarian, but basically two separate levels or multiple levels that are operating with some degree of sovereignty. Now, when we talk about federalism as a thing, we're talking about that relationship that exists. That relationship that exists in a federal-style government that we have between the national and the state governments that exist. So, just so that we're all on the same page here, in America we have a singular national government, which we call the federal government. But then we also have 50 state governments that exist simultaneously, obviously one for each of the states, and that national government and those state governments operate in their own realms of power simultaneously, each with their own degree of sovereignty. In other words, in our system, there are national powers that the states cannot take away, but then there's also state powers that the federal government cannot take away. And so when we talk about this relationship that exists, we have to keep in mind that, like any other kind of a relationship, relationships are never static. They're always in motion. So when we talk about federalism, it's this continuing, evolving discussion of what that relationship is between the federal and the state governments. Is it a situation where the states are creeping up on the federal government to take more power? Is the federal government kind of dominating the state governments? So understand, it's a study of what that relationship is over time. And we're obviously going to get into that later on in this topic. Now, when we talk about a federal-style government, it is designed to be basically the best of two different worlds, between what we would consider a unitary-style system and a confederal-style system. A unitary-style system is where there is one singular national government that has sovereignty. That's it. There is no subunit that exists out there in terms of having sovereignty. So there's only a national government, and every other subunit exists at the pleasure of the national government, which means that at any time the national government can create, destroy, redraw, combine, whatever, all of the subunits in government. The only thing that has sovereignty is that national level. So if you go to the UK, for example, there's Parliament that runs the national government, but below that there are what we call counties in England, for example. Those counties only exist at the pleasure of Parliament. That's it. They could destroy counties, combine counties, reorganize counties. All the powers and responsibilities that counties have exist only because the national government allows them to. There are no counties in England that have some degree of sovereignty. It just does not exist. Now, another type of government that we try to take the best from is a confederal-style government, which we have, much more much more experience with in many respects than a unitary government, at least as an independent country. A confederal-style government is basically an alliance between a number of sovereign states, if you will. And what happens is that in that arrangement, the sovereign states come together and create from them a national government. And see how that's the opposite from a unitary government. The national government is the thing that exists to begin with. Then it creates lower governments. In a confederal-style government, it's these lower, smaller governments that come together to create a bigger singular government that ties the states together. However, that national government does not really have sovereignty. It only exists, according to the whims and desires of those various states, which means that national government can be changed, limited, whatever, as long as the states want to do it. It's the states that have sovereignty in a confederal system, whereas in a unitary style, it's only the national government. Examples of a confederal style government in history, at least for the United States, include the Articles of Confederation, which we talked about previously. But then also don't forget what the southern slave states in the mid-19th century were attempting to do when they, rose up in rebellion against the Union in the Civil War. They were attempting to bring back a confederal style government, with the idea being is that they were afraid that, at least from their perspective up to that point under the Constitution, was a strong national government that was going to deny them their property rights, i.e. the ability to own slaves. So the idea being is that they were going to have this kind of loose alliance of slave-owning states that would create a national government for very limited purposes, with the states maintaining sovereignty. So understand, those are kind of two prevailing things. And note, in today's world, Switzerland kind of has a confederal government as well. The various cantons that exist create a national government that has limited authority in Switzerland. So that's kind of been, there's kind of like the two poles, if you will, unitary versus confederal. And so what we decided to do is create something different, a federal style government that is going to be the best of both worlds. And once again, we start the modern federal government, but we're not the only one that exists today. If you go to Mexico, it's a federal government. Brazil has a federal government. Germany has a federal government. Australia does. So there are a handful of countries that do have that, but mostly kind of following our lead. Now, why do we decide to go this route instead of the unitary or the confederal style? Well, it's due to our history. We had histories with both of those kinds of governments. But remember, when it was a unitary style government, it's when we were colonists of England. And we felt that the unitary power of Parliament far away was too tyrannical. So the idea of a singular national government controlling everything, that was tyrannical. We didn't want that. And that's why we tried the exact opposite of a confederal style government with the Articles of Confederation. Then we found that was really too weak. The national government was not able to provide any kind of functional stability from a military defense perspective to an economic perspective. And so the idea being is you want kind of the best of both. And so what is the best of both? You're talking about having dual degrees of sovereignty. Not just the national government, not just the states, but some of both. So when we get into that, it behooves us to have an idea of, what are some of these powers, at least explicitly written in the Constitution, or at least how does the Constitution address this idea of having a federal system within it? Well, part of these include what we call exclusive powers or delegated. We use those terms interchangeably. And what this involves are powers that would be seen, at least based on our history, as obvious, assumed powers that any kind of national government would have because it's just not functional otherwise. So, for example, there's a national military. There's not independent state militaries that exist. There's a national currency, not state currency. There's a national standard for issuing patents, not various state levels. And so these things are, yes, mentioned explicitly in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and these are assumed to be, just kind of assumed powers of a national government. Now, you've also got in Article 4 where it talks about various relations between states in a federal-style system. Part of that involves full faith and credit, which says that any legal document of one state is to be recognized in all the other states. So if you get married in Nevada marriage license, it's legal in Ohio. You also have the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which basically says you cannot discriminate against people from other states for arbitrary reasons. So you can't say that here in Ohio, the speed limit on our highways are 70 miles an hour, but if you're from out of state, it has to be 60 miles an hour. It doesn't work that way. You cannot discriminate in what is a clearly arbitrary way. And also, Article 4 involves extradition. Extradition is the power to take someone that has been charged with a crime that's fled from one government to another government, and that government returning said fugitive to the government that is seeking to charge them with a crime. On an international level, the United States has what we call extradition treaties with most countries. Now there might be some individual, exceptions on certain things like the death penalty or whatever, but the idea being is that if you are a fugitive in the United States and you flee to France, we have an extradition treaty with France so that if a fugitive of ours is caught in France, the French government will turn them over, and vice versa. Now, other countries, we don't have that with, like, say, Russia, for example. But within our own country, Article 4 talks about that states have to extradite people from other states. So in other words, it's not like an international level where it's done by treaty and it can have loopholes and whatever. Article 4 says, no. Straight up, if you are someone that is charged with a crime in Texas and you flee to Arizona and the Arizona authorities capture you for whatever reason, you must extradite that prisoner back to Texas. There's no exceptions to that. You must extradite them. So that shows some of the idea. Article 4 is a lot of like tying together the various state governments under the Constitution. But of course, when we do talk about a federal style government with two different levels existing simultaneously, each with their own degree of sovereignty, what if there is a collision of powers? What if a state asserts some type of authority that comes into conflict with what the national government is asserting as authority? Well, Article 6 includes what we call the Supremacy Clause, which basically states that if there is a conflict between the state and the national governments, that conflict is settled with the national government being supreme. So basically, whenever there's a clash between the two levels of power, the national government always wins. So that doesn't mean the national government controls everything. There are things that only exclusively go to the state government. We call those reserve powers. A lot of that's covered in the 10th Amendment. But if it's kind of gray and we're not sure if it's a federal power, or a state power, or if it's something that both can do, and there's a conflict, the national government always wins. And speaking of some things where the federal government and the state government can do together, we do see those things exist in our Constitution. We call those concurrent powers. Concurrent meaning happening simultaneously. So, for example, if we have national and state governments that are existing simultaneously, they both have to be funded, meaning they have to be funded through taxes, which means that both the national and the state governments have the power to tax. Otherwise, they don't have the ability to functionally exist. So you can be taxed at the federal and the state level because both are sovereign and they both have to have an ability to exist. They both have their own court systems, for example. The national government has a federal court system that deals with only federal matters. So, for example, if you're talking about crimes such as counterfeiting, big-time drug trafficking, kidnapping across state lines, those are federal crimes, which means only the federal government, the national government, can try you. So there's a federal system for federal crimes. But then there's also various, there's 50 different state court systems. Those are exclusive to state crimes. The vast majority of crimes that we are familiar with, be it, grand theft auto or check fraud or murder or, anything along those lines, those are state crimes, which means they have to be heard in those state courts where the crime is to have alleged to have occurred. A federal government court cannot hear a state crime, and vice versa. So you've got these two parallel court systems that operate at the same time, and it's allowable because it's a federal system, not a national, not a unitary, not a confederal system. All right? So, little introduction into what federalism is and how or where it's found in the Constitution. We'll see you with some more videos later on. Bye-bye.